Welcome. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle. Take a slow breath in, and let it out. Tonight, we are going to travel somewhere very far away. Not just far in distance, but far in time. We are going back almost 2,000 years. To a city that was once the center of the entire known world. A city of marble and mud, of noise and stillness, of grand temples and tiny apartments. We are going to ancient Rome. But we are not going there as tourists rushing through museums. We are going there slowly, quietly, the way you might wander through a place on a calm afternoon with nowhere else to be. We are going to walk the streets, sit in the markets, watch the bakers pull bread from their ovens before the sun has even risen. We are going to follow ordinary people through their ordinary days. And in doing so, we are going to see something quite beautiful. That life, even 2,000 years ago, had a rhythm to it. A gentle, familiar rhythm, not so different from our own. So let your eyes grow heavy. Let your breathing slow, and let me take you, gently, back to the streets of ancient Rome. Imagine you are standing in Rome just before dawn. The sky is a deep, soft blue. Not quite night, not quite morning. The kind of sky that exists only for a few quiet minutes before the world remembers itself. The city is mostly still, but not entirely. Even now, before the sun has touched the rooftops, Rome is beginning to stir. And this is important to understand about Rome. It was never truly silent. It was a city of over 1 million people. At its peak, it may have held even more. And a city that large is always, in some corner, always alive. The streets of Rome were narrow. Far narrower than we might imagine. Most of them were barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side comfortably. The buildings on either side rose tall. 4, 5, sometimes 6 stories high. These were the insulae, the apartment blocks where most ordinary Romans lived. They leaned slightly toward each other at the top, as if whispering secrets across the alleyway. Down at street level, the ground was paved with large, flat stones. Smooth in the middle from thousands of years of feet, worn into soft curves and dips. You can still see those stones today if you visit Rome. You can still see the grooves carved into them by the wheels of ancient carts. And it is those carts we hear first, even now in the early darkness. Because Roman law had a rule, a practical, sensible rule for a city so crowded. Wheeled vehicles were not allowed on the main streets during the day. The roads were too narrow, the foot traffic too heavy. So the carts came at night. The delivery wagons, the construction carts, the animals pulling loads of grain and timber and building stone. All through the night they rolled and rumbled. And so the people of Rome fell asleep to the sound of wheels on stone. To the low groan of oxen. To the distant creak of wooden axles. By the time dawn approached, the last of those carts were making their final runs. And in their place, something quieter began to take over. The smell of bread. Bakeries in Rome were called pistrina, and there were hundreds of them scattered throughout the city. Because most Romans who lived in those tall apartment buildings had no kitchens. Or rather, they had tiny braziers, small portable fire pots, that were dangerous to use in close quarters. Many buildings had burned down because someone tried to cook a proper meal in a cramped upper floor room. And so the bakers became essential. They baked through the night. And by early morning, the smell of fresh bread drifted through every alley and courtyard of the city. It is a good smell to wake up to. A familiar smell, a comforting one. The Romans knew this, too. As the sky lightens to a pale gray and then slowly to gold, the people of Rome begin their mornings. Let us follow one ordinary person. Not a senator, not a general, just a man. Let us call him Marcus. He is a craftsman. He makes small clay oil lamps. He lives on the third floor of an insula near the Aventine Hill with his wife and 2 children. Marcus wakes early. Most Romans did. The day in ancient Rome was divided into 12 hours of daylight. So in summer, each hour was longer. In winter, shorter. But regardless of season, the Romans rose with the light. To sleep past sunrise was considered lazy and wasteful. The day was a gift. You were expected to use it. Marcus does not have an alarm. He has a city that never quite quiets down. The sounds of the street below have shifted now from the grinding of carts to the voices of people. To the cry of a vendor already setting up his stall. To children somewhere nearby. He dresses quickly. Romans did not have the complicated layers of clothing we might imagine from paintings or films. For an ordinary man like Marcus, mornings were simple. A tunic, a belt, sandals, if he had a good pair. Boots if the weather was cold or wet. The toga, that famous draped garment we associate so strongly with Rome, was actually quite inconvenient. Heavy, difficult to arrange, easy to dirty. It was formal wear. Most Romans wore it only for important occasions. On an ordinary working morning, the tunic was enough. His wife, Livia, is already awake. She has gone down to the street to buy bread from the bakery 2 doors down. This is the morning routine. A loaf of bread, perhaps some olives, a bit of hard cheese if they have it. The Romans called this the ientaculum, the first meal of the day. It was not a large meal. The Romans did not place great importance on breakfast. It was fuel, something to have before the work of the day began. Marcus eats his bread leaning in the doorway, watching the street below slowly fill with people. He watches a man carrying a large clay pot on his shoulder. He watches a group of children chasing each other around a corner. He watches an old woman sitting outside her door, spinning wool, her hands moving with the slow patience of someone who has done this same thing every morning for 50 years. There is comfort in watching other people live. Marcus finishes his bread. He drinks a small cup of water. He says something quiet to Livia. She hands him his tools. And he goes downstairs to his workshop, which occupies a small space on the ground floor of the building. Most Roman apartment buildings had shops and workshops built into their lower floors. The craftsmen and tradespeople lived above their work. Marcus opens the wooden shutter that serves as his shop front. The street comes flooding in with all its sounds and smells and light. And the day begins. Let us step outside now. Let us take a slow walk through the streets of this ancient city as the morning reaches its full height. The streets are busy now. Properly busy. Rome at midday was crowded in a way that is hard to fully picture. There were no cars, of course. No buses or bicycles. But there were people. Thousands upon thousands of them. All on foot. All moving through those same narrow streets, past those same tall buildings. The noise was extraordinary. Romans themselves wrote about it. The poet Juvenal, who lived in Rome around the 1st century, complained about the city's noise with great feeling. The shouting of vendors, the hammering of craftsmen, the barking of dogs, the crying of children, the endless, layered human sound of a city that never truly rested. And the smells. Let us be honest about the smells. Rome did not have a perfect sewage system. The Great Sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, was a genuine engineering achievement, and the city had public toilets and some underground drainage. But most waste from upper-floor apartments was emptied into large clay pots that were collected, or sometimes, despite laws against it, simply tossed out of windows into the street. The Roman satirists wrote about this hazard with dark humor. Walking under a window at the wrong moment was considered genuinely bad luck. And yet alongside those less pleasant smells, there was also the smell of food cooking, of spices from the east, of leather from the shoemakers, of sawdust from the carpenters, of flowers from the garland sellers near the temples, of warm stone baking gently in the sun. Rome was a place of contrasts, beauty and squalor, order and chaos, grand marble temples rising above cramped, smoky alleyways. The streets were not just for walking. They were for everything. Street vendors sold hot food from small portable counters. There were thermopolia all through the city, small eateries built into the walls of buildings, with large clay jars set into stone counters, filled with warm stews and sauces. You could stop, hand over a coin or two, and eat standing up at the counter, watching the street, before moving on with your day. There were barbers doing their work outdoors, their customers sitting on small stools in the morning sun, chatting with whoever passed by. Barbers in Rome were known as great talkers. To sit in the barber's chair was to receive both a shave and all the gossip of the neighborhood. There were fortune tellers and astrologers with small folding tables. There were scribes who would write letters for those who could not write themselves. There were money changers and herb sellers and teachers conducting outdoor lessons with small groups of children sitting around them on the pavement. The street was an extension of the home. Because the homes were so small and so dark, life spilled outward naturally. The street was where you cooked, where you ate, where you worked, where you argued, where you fell in love, where you grew old. It was alive in a way that is hard for us to imagine from our own quiet rooms. And yet, in its own way, there was a piece to it. A rhythm. The rhythm of a city that had been doing this, more or less, for centuries. Each person finding their place in the flow of it. Let us move gently now to another part of life in ancient Rome. Food in ancient Rome tells us so much about who the Romans were. Let us sit down for a moment, in the shade of a colonnade, and think about what people ate. About how they grew their food, how they cooked it, how they shared it. For most ordinary Romans, life was not one of great feasts. That image of Romans lying on cushions eating exotic foods while musicians played, that was the life of the very wealthy. The upper classes, the senators and wealthy merchants and successful landowners. For the craftsman Marcus and his family, food was simpler. And it was good, in its own way. The staple of the Roman diet was grain. Specifically, a grain called emmer wheat, or later the more familiar bread wheat. It was made into bread. It was made into a kind of thick porridge called pulse. This pulse, a simple mixture of grain and water, sometimes with olive oil or salt or whatever else was available, was eaten by millions of Romans every day for centuries. It was filling and reliable. It was not glamorous, but it was sustaining. The Romans also loved olives and olive oil deeply. Olive oil was everything. It was for cooking, yes, but also for lighting lamps. For cleaning the body, since many Romans used oil and a scraping tool instead of soap. For preserving foods. For medicine. The olive groves that spread across Italy, Spain, North Africa, and Greece were the quiet engine of the Roman world. Wine was the drink of Rome. And this too requires a small adjustment of our modern imagination. Roman wine was not what we drink today. It was thick and sweet and very strong. It was almost always diluted with water before drinking. To drink wine undiluted was considered barbaric, something only foreigners did. A proper Roman mixed his wine carefully, with warm water, sometimes with cold water, sometimes with sea water, which sounds terrible to us but was completely normal to them. Even children drank diluted wine. Clean drinking water was not always reliable, and the diluted wine was safer. At the markets, called miscela, you could buy all manner of foods depending on the season and your budget. Fresh vegetables, beans, lentils, figs and dates, honey, which was used both as a sweetener and a preservative. Fish of many kinds, both fresh from the sea or rivers, and preserved in salt or in a famous fermented fish sauce called garum. Garum deserves a moment of attention. It was made from the fermented intestines and blood of fish, layered with salt in large clay jars and left to ferment in the sun for weeks or even months. The resulting liquid was a dark, pungent, intensely flavored sauce. And the Romans put it on almost everything, the way we might use salt, or soy sauce, or Worcestershire sauce today. It was the great flavor of the ancient world, and in truth, garum is not so different from certain Southeast Asian fish sauces that are still used today and deeply loved. The flavor is complex, rich, savory. The Romans were not wrong to love it. The main meal of the Roman day was the cena, the evening meal. This was eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, when the work of the day was done. For ordinary families, this might be a bowl of pottage with bread and olives. Perhaps some fresh vegetables in season, a bit of salted fish, a cup of watered wine. It was quiet and domestic. Family gathered around a low table, the sounds of the street beginning to settle outside, the oil lamps flickering softly in the corners of the room. There is something timeless in that image. People around a table at the end of a long day, eating simple food, talking about small things, letting the day go. There is perhaps no place in Roman life more interesting to imagine than the baths. The Thermae. Let us walk there now. It is mid-afternoon. The worst heat of the day is beginning to ease. The city is a little quieter than it was at midday. Many Romans have observed a short rest period around midday, a kind of afternoon quiet time not unlike the siesta still practiced in parts of the Mediterranean world today. And now, as things gently stir again, people are making their way to the baths. The public baths of Rome were unlike anything we have today. They were not simply places to wash. They were community centers, social spaces, places to exercise, to talk, to do business, to relax, to see and be seen. The largest bathhouses in Rome were enormous. The baths of Caracalla, built in the early 3rd century, could hold over 1,000 people at once. They had soaring vaulted ceilings, floors covered in intricate mosaics, libraries, gardens, spaces for exercise and sports, rooms for massage and treatments, hot rooms and cold rooms and warm rooms and steam rooms. They smelled of warm water and oil and perfume and the damp stone of their great walls. Entry was either free or very cheap. The emperors subsidized the baths because they understood something important. Happy citizens are less likely to cause trouble. And what made citizens happy was bread, entertainment, and a good bath. This is where the famous phrase panem et circenses comes from. Bread and circuses. Give the people what their bodies and spirits need, and the city remains peaceful. The bathing process had a rhythm to it, a sequence that most Romans followed with comfortable familiarity. First, you might exercise in the open courtyard, called the palaestra. Running, wrestling, lifting weights, playing a ball game, working up a sweat, loosening the body after a day of physical work. Then into the changing rooms. You left your clothes with a slave attendant, or if you could not afford that, you kept a careful eye on them yourself, because theft in the baths was notoriously common. Roman writers made jokes about it. You came out having lost your good cloak and your dignity. From the changing rooms, you moved through the sequence of rooms. The tepidarium first. The warm room. Not hot, not cold, just pleasantly warm. This was where your body began to adjust. Where you might sit and talk with friends or strangers. Where the social texture of the baths began to reveal itself. Then the caldarium. The hot room. With its steaming pool. The heat was intense but gentle if you were accustomed to it. Here people sweated deeply, their bodies releasing the dust and labor of the day. Slaves or paid attendants would scrape the body with a curved metal tool called a strigil, removing the oil and sweat and dirt. This was the Roman version of washing. Oil applied, sweat induced, skin scraped clean. And then, for the brave, the frigidarium. The cold pool. A plunge into cool or cold water that left you breathless and tingling and fully, completely awake. After this came the moment of real pleasure. Wrapped in a cloth, your body warm and clean, you found a spot to sit or lie. Perhaps a slave brought you a cup of wine. Perhaps a friend joined you and you fell into easy conversation about nothing in particular. Romans of all classes came to the baths. The wealthy and the ordinary. The young and the old. Men and women, usually in separate sections or at separate hours, though in some periods mixed bathing was permitted and caused much disapproval among the more traditional writers of the time. In the baths, the strict social hierarchies of Roman life softened slightly. A senator and a craftsman, both wrapped in their towels, both human and warm and clean, were for a moment simply two people sharing a room. There is something quietly profound about that. The bath is equalizer, the warm water that asks nothing about who you are or where you came from. As the afternoon deepens toward evening, let us slow our walk still further. Let us step into the shade of a temple portico and talk about the gods of Rome. Because the gods were everywhere in Roman life. Everywhere. Not just in the great temples on the hills. But in the home, in the street, in the workshop, in the fields. The Roman world was saturated with the divine in a way that is hard for us to fully imagine. Every Roman household had a Narration, a small shrine, usually set into a wall or placed in the corner of the main room. It held small clay or bronze figurines of the Lares, the household gods, the protective spirits of the family and the home. Every morning, the family made a small offering at the Narration. A bit of food, some incense, a small cake or a sprinkle of grain, a quiet word or prayer. This was not a dramatic religious ritual. It was domestic and comfortable. Like lighting a candle, like saying a few words before a meal. It was simply part of the texture of daily life. The gods of Rome were numerous. They had the great Olympian gods borrowed and adapted from the Greeks. Jupiter, king of the gods. Juno, his wife. Mars, god of war. Venus, goddess of love. Mercury, swift messenger. Neptune, lord of the sea. Diana, huntress and moon goddess. Minerva, patron of crafts and wisdom. And alongside these great gods, there were countless smaller ones. Gods of crossroads. Gods of doorways and thresholds. Gods of rivers and springs. Gods of the hearth fire and the grain store and the city walls. Rome was a world in which the divine and the everyday were woven together without any sharp boundary between them. The Romans were also remarkably open to foreign gods. As Rome conquered new peoples and absorbed new territories, it absorbed their gods too. The Egyptian goddess Isis became enormously popular in Rome. The Persian god Mithras had devoted followers among the soldiers of the legions. And eventually, of course, a small Jewish sect from the eastern provinces would transform into the religion we now call Christianity, and the two would spread through Rome until it reshaped the entire empire. But in our period, in the 1st century, the old gods still held their places in their old temples. On festival days, which came quite frequently in the Roman calendar, there were public processions. Priests in white robes carrying sacred objects, musicians playing, citizens lining the streets, animals, usually oxen or pigs, being led to the great altars for sacrifice. These festivals were not solemn or sorrowful. They were celebrations, a day off from work, a chance to gather, to eat well, to feel part of something larger than yourself. Religion in Rome was less about personal belief in a theological sense, and more about right action. Doing the correct things at the correct times. Making the correct offerings. Observing the correct rituals. If you did these things, the gods were satisfied. The city was protected. The crops would grow. The legions would prevail. Everything was well. It was a religion of rhythm and repetition. Of the same prayers said in the same ways in the same places across generations. There is something deeply calming about that kind of faith. Its familiarity. Its continuity with the past. Let us return now to the apartment on the Aventine Hill. To Marcus and Livia and their children. Evening is coming. The light is changing. The long afternoon gold is softening into something warmer and gentler. The shadows in the alleyways are growing longer and deeper. Family life in ancient Rome was, at its heart, not so different from family life in most places and times. Parents who worried about their children. Children who tested boundaries and then needed comforting. The small daily negotiations of people living closely together. Roman families were organized around the concept of the paterfamilias. The father, the head of the household, held significant legal authority over all family members. Technically, this authority was considerable, but in practice, day-to-day family life was warm and involved and affectionate, as we know from the many letters and poems and inscriptions Romans left behind. Tombstones tell us much. The inscriptions on the graves of children, written by grieving parents, speak of beloved little ones taken too soon. Of bright eyes and quick laughter and the unbearable silence left behind. These words, carved in stone 2,000 years ago, feel entirely familiar. The love they express is not historical. It is human. Children in Rome played. We know their games. We have found their toys in archaeological digs. Small wooden horses on wheels. Dolls with jointed limbs made from bone or ivory. Clay rattles and whistles. Knuckle bones, the ancient version of jacks, played with the ankle bones of sheep. Hoops rolled along the street with a stick. Ball games. Hide and seek. The streets and courtyards of Rome rang with the voices of children exactly as streets and courtyards do today. Formal education was available for those who could afford it. Boys from wealthier families, and sometimes girls, would be sent to a teacher called a grammaticus, who held lessons, often outdoors, in covered walkways or market squares. The curriculum was reading and writing in both Latin and Greek, mathematics, some history and literature. Memorization played a large part. Roman students learned by reciting aloud, by copying texts, by committing long passages of poetry and prose to memory. For the children of poorer families, like those of Marcus the lamp maker, formal education was less likely. Boys often learned their father's trade by watching and helping. Girls learned the skills of the household from their mothers. How to spin and weave. How to manage a home. How to cook and preserve food and tend to younger children. But literacy in Rome was more widespread than we might imagine. The walls of Pompeii, that city frozen in time by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, are covered in graffiti. Election slogans, declarations of love, jokes, insults, advertisements for gladiatorial games. The fact that people wrote these things on walls suggests they expected other people to be able to read them. Literacy was not just for the elite. In the evenings, the family gathered. In winter, around the small warmth of their brazier. In summer, perhaps in the courtyard or on the rooftop if the building had one. The children would be getting tired by now. The day had been long and full. Livia is spinning wool by lamplight. This is the image the Romans themselves most associated with ideal womanhood. The industrious wife, spinning in the lamplight, steady and present. It is an image of great calm, of a life that is not glamorous but is whole. Marcus is telling the children something. A story, perhaps. The Romans had stories, fables passed down from the Greeks, tales of the gods, local legends, the kinds of stories parents tell children to make the world seem bigger and more interesting and slightly magical. The children are growing heavy with sleep. One of them, the younger one, a girl, is already leaning against her father's arm with her eyes closing. And the lamp burns quietly in the corner. Before the evening settles fully, let us take one more walk. A slower one this time. Let us think about work. About the many ways ordinary Romans made their lives. Rome was a city of extraordinary trade and craft. The shops and workshops that lined the ground floors of the Insulae produced and sold almost everything a city of 1 million people might need. There were fullers, who cleaned and treated woolen cloth. The fulleries of Rome were distinctive places. Woolen cloth was soaked in large vats and trampled by workers using their feet to clean and thicken the fibers. The chemicals used included urine, which was collected from large clay pots placed on street corners for that purpose. Passers-by were expected to contribute. The fullers paid for the privilege of collecting it. It sounds strange to us. But it worked. There were smiths, iron workers and bronze workers and goldsmiths and silversmiths. The sound of hammering was constant in certain districts. The Subura, the crowded valley district between the hills, was known for its workshops and noise and the particular kind of busy energy that comes from many people making things. There were tanners and leatherworkers, cobblers making shoes and sandals, rope makers and basket weavers, potters producing the vast quantities of clay vessels the Roman world ran on, storage jars and water jugs and oil lamps and cooking pots and the elegant red glazed tableware called terra sigillata that the wealthier households used for their meals. There were doctors and dentists, though their methods would alarm a modern patient. There were lawyers and scribes and teachers. There were architects and engineers and surveyors. Rome was always building, always expanding, always repairing what had been damaged by time or flood or fire. There were entertainers, musicians who played at dinner parties and funerals and religious festivals, actors who performed in the great outdoor theaters, acrobats and jugglers who performed in the streets and in taverns, storytellers who gathered small crowds in the shade of a colonnade. And there were the slaves. We cannot talk about Roman daily life without talking about slavery. It was embedded in every part of Roman society. Rome was a slave society in the most complete sense. Estimates suggest that perhaps a quarter to a third of the population of Roman Italy were enslaved. Some historians suggest even higher numbers in the city itself. Slaves did everything. They worked in the fields and in the mines, which was brutal and often fatal. They worked in wealthy households as cooks, teachers, secretaries, accountants, doctors. They worked in shops and workshops alongside their owners. Some slaves were highly educated and trusted with great responsibilities. Some were treated with relative decency. Many were not. The Romans knew that slavery was a condition that could befall anyone. The philosopher Seneca wrote thoughtfully about the humanity of enslaved people, the chance circumstance of birth and fortune that separated the free from the unfree. These words were written by a man who himself owned slaves, which tells you something about the complexity and contradiction of Roman moral thinking. But the slaves were there. In every household, in every street scene, part of every daily tableau. And their stories, for the most part, went unrecorded. We see them in the edges of the pictures. Carrying loads, serving food, standing quietly in doorways, present but unnamed. There is a heaviness in thinking about this. And we should sit with it for a moment, quietly, before we move on. It is part of the full picture of this world. As the working day ends and the evening begins, the Romans turn to pleasure. And the Romans were genuinely good at pleasure. They pursued it with thought and organization. The theater was ancient and beloved in Rome. The great playwrights of the earlier centuries, men like Plautus and Terence, had written comedies that were performed for centuries. Roman theater was lively and populist. Comedies full of misunderstandings and disguises and scheming servants outwitting pompous masters. The audiences were loud and enthusiastic and not above booing a performance they disliked. The Circus Maximus was the great chariot racing venue. It sat in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills and could hold over 100,000 spectators. On race days, the city practically stopped. The charioteers raced in teams identified by colors: blue, green, red, white. The Romans supported their team with a passion we would entirely recognize in the sports fans of today. They argued about it. They bet on it. They wrote prayers to the gods asking for victory. They wrote curses against rival teams and their horses and their drivers, scratching the words onto thin sheets of lead and throwing them into sacred springs or burying them in the ground. The Colosseum, or the Flavian Amphitheater as it was properly called, hosted the gladiatorial games. This is perhaps the aspect of Roman life most familiar to modern audiences, and also the most misunderstood. The games were spectacle, grand, expensive spectacle funded by emperors and wealthy patrons to win the affection of the people. The gladiators were a mixture of condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and volunteers, yes, volunteers, who chose the profession for its guaranteed food and housing and the possibility, if they were skilled enough and survived long enough, of fame and even freedom. Not every fight ended in death. Many gladiators fought multiple times over years. Killing a skilled gladiator was wasteful. He was expensive to train. The crowd did not always want death. Sometimes they wanted skill, performance, the theatrical tension of a close fight well fought. This does not make the games gentle. They were violent. People died. But the Romans understood them differently than we do. As a society that lived with violence and death in ways that were more immediate and unavoidable than our own experience, the games occupied a different emotional place. But on quieter evenings, Roman leisure was gentler. The taverns, the compane, hundreds of them in every neighborhood. Small, warm, often dark, smelling of wine and lamp oil and whatever was being cooked in the back. These were places where working people gathered after the day was done. To drink watered wine, to play dice or board games, to talk. The Romans loved games. We have found game boards carved into pavements and building floors all over the Roman world. Soldiers carved them into the stones near city gates where they stood guard. Children scratched them into courtyard walls. The game of dice was so popular and so associated with gambling and dishonesty that it was technically illegal in Rome, except during the festival of Saturnalia in December. But this law was almost universally ignored. The Romans gambled with cheerful dedication regardless of what the law said. Evenings in the tavern had a particular warmth. The crowded room, the low murmur of conversation, the flicker of oil lamps, the sound of dice on a wooden table, someone laughing at something in the back of the room. The kind of warm human noise that tells you, even when you are tired, that you are not alone. And now the day is ending. The sky above Rome has shifted through all its colors. The blue of early morning through the gold of afternoon through the deep copper and rose of sunset. And now the stars are beginning to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky above the city. In the streets below, the oil lamps are being lit. In every window, in every doorway, tiny flames appear. Rome at night was not dark in the absolute way that most ancient cities were dark. It had a soft, warm glow, the particular amber light of a million small flames. Seen from the hills above, it must have been beautiful. The night street was a different place than the day street. The crowds had thinned. The vendors had packed up. The children had been taken inside. In certain streets, the night people were beginning to emerge. The night watchmen, the vigils, who also served as firefighters, patrolling with their torches. The late diners making their way home from a wealthy friend's cena. The less reputable figures who preferred the darkness. Most ordinary Romans were indoors by full dark. Candles and oil lamps were expensive. You used them carefully. You did what you needed to do by their light and then you slept. Sleep in Rome was different from our own. The idea of sleeping a single long stretch of 8 hours at night is actually quite modern. For much of human history, sleep was divided. People slept for a few hours in the early night, then woke for an hour or two, then slept again until morning. This first sleep and second sleep pattern was perfectly normal and widely accepted. The hours between were sometimes used for quiet reflection, for prayer, for conversation with a sleeping partner, for reading by lamplight. And so Marcus and Livia, in their apartment on the Aventine Hill, have settled for the night. The children are asleep on their low beds in the corner of the main room. The brazier has been carefully banked, its glow a dim red in the darkness. The lamp has been extinguished. Somewhere below in the street, the last cart of the night is making its way along the stones. The sound drifts up through the shuttered window, low and slow and rhythmic. The city breathes. The great city, the eternal city, A million souls all resting in their small rooms in apartments and houses, all breathing together in the dark. On the Capitoline Hill, the temple of Jupiter stands white and silent in the moonlight. The Colosseum is a dark curve against the stars. The Circus Maximus is empty and still, its long spine of stone pale in the darkness. The Tiber River moves slowly through the city, black and quiet, carrying the reflections of stars. Rome sleeps, and so we come to the end of our journey. We have walked a long way tonight, through the early morning streets with their rumbling carts and their smell of fresh bread, through the crowded midday markets and the busy workshops, through the warmth and steam of the great baths, through the temples with their incense and their small clay offerings. We sat with a family at their evening meal. Simple food, lamplight, the voices of children growing quieter as the night came on. We watched the city move through all its hours, from the first gray light to the last amber glow of lamp flames in darkened windows. And what we found, I think, was something comforting. We found that people have always been people, that they have always woken up uncertain about their day and found their way through it, that they have always loved their children and worried about money and taken pleasure in small things. A good loaf of bread, a warm bath, a cup of wine with a friend at the end of a long day, a game of dice by lamplight. 2,000 years separate us from the Romans. And yet across all that time, all that history, all those centuries of change and loss and transformation, something persists. The human heart persists. Its hungers and its loves. Its weariness at the end of the day. Its need for rest and warmth and the quiet company of people it trusts. You are not so different from Marcus, drifting off to sleep in his apartment above the workshop. You are not so different from Livia, her hands finally still after a long day of work. You are not so different from those children, their bodies soft with sleep, their dreams carrying them somewhere gentle. We are all, across time, just people at the end of a day, needing rest, finding it. So let your body grow heavy now. Let the sounds of your own world grow distant and soft. Let the stories settle around you like something warm and familiar. The night is quiet. The stars are out. The great city rests. And so can you. Good night.